Good afternoon. I'm Jim Goldgeier, Dean of the School of International Service, and it's a great honor and pleasure to welcome you here to this afternoon's event with Ambassador Susan Rice, the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. SIS was founded through a call by President Dwight Eisenhower to wage peace, and promoting human rights has been central to our mission from the beginning. We're honored to co-sponsor this event on protecting and promoting LGBTQ human rights around the world with Human Rights First and Human Rights Campaign. And we're very grateful to AU alum and former AU Student Body President Sarah McBride, who played such an important role in enabling this speech to occur here today. After Ambassador Rice's remarks, we will have a brief Q&A session drawing on questions that are tweeted using the hashtag Global Equality. It's now my pleasure to introduce Elisa Massimino, President and Chief Executive Officer of Human Rights First, one of the nation's leading human rights advocacy organizations. Established in 1978, Human Rights First's mission is to ensure that the United States is a global leader on human rights. Ms. Massimino has been with Human Rights First since 1991, serving previously as staff attorney and then Washington director. And since 2008, The Hill has consistently named her one of the most effective public advocates in the country. Please join me in welcoming Elisa Massimino.
Thank you so much, Jim, for that kind introduction. It is really an honor for Human Rights First to be part of this important conversation about the Obama administration's leadership in advancing the human rights of LGBT people everywhere. And it's especially appropriate that Ambassador Susan Rice is here to lead this discussion. The intersection of national security and the human rights of LGBT people is at the heart of our core beliefs, that respect for human rights is the foundation of peace and security in the world, and that our country is safer and stronger when it lives up to its ideals of dignity and equality. We've come a long way on LGBT equality here at home, from the passage of the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, to the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, to the triumph of marriage equality at the Supreme Court. But just 10 years ago, the integration of concern for the rights and security of LGBT people in U.S. foreign policy seemed almost inconceivable. In 2011, that changed when President Obama issued a directive instructing all U.S. agencies working abroad to integrate concern for the rights and security of LGBT people into everything they do. That directive and the persistent efforts to implement it is making a difference in the global struggle for equality and in the lives of LGBT people in some of the toughest places in the world. For example, in 2014, when Uganda enacted a harsh new anti-LGBT law, the administration imposed targeted limits on cooperation with the government. Last year, Randy Berry, the first ever special envoy for the human rights of LGBTI persons, and Todd Larson, senior LGBT coordinator at USAID, both outstanding public servants and real champions of this cause, they're here today, traveled to Jamaica and engaged government and civil society leaders in thoughtful dialogue about how to improve the situation for LGBT Jamaicans. And last year, the United States led a historic meeting at the UN Security Council to highlight the brutality of ISIS against LGBT people. I'm proud of what our team at Human Rights First has accomplished in the last several years. We were there for the 2014 Olympics in Sochi, amplifying the voices of brave Russian activists. We've been on the ground in El Salvador, partnering with transgender women who are pushing for an end to the unrelenting daily violence that they face. We've ensured that U.S. engagement on LGBT issues in the Caribbean moves forward in a way that is respectful but determined. And we've raised the alarm on legislation moving right now in Kyrgyzstan that would impose prison sentences on anyone who speaks positively about the LGBT community. Imagine that. There is much work to do, but thanks to the vision and persistence of the Obama administration and of Ambassador Rice in particular, courageous activists around the world seeking to promote the rights and equality of LGBT people know that America stands with them in their struggle. We've been so proud to join forces with bold and imaginative advocates in the administration and with those outside government, like our next speaker, Chad Griffin. As president of the Human Rights Campaign, Chad has steered the organization into an exciting new era. From record-breaking investment in the 2012 elections to historic advocacy around the Supreme Court rulings striking down Proposition 8 and the Defense of Marriage Act, Chad has brought passion and energy to a fight that is inspiring LGBTQ and straight Americans around the country. And he's working to extend this effort to millions more in the American South, as well as internationally. Please join me in welcoming my friend and colleague, Chad Griffin.
Thank you all so much, and thank you, Elisa, for that kind introduction and for the important work that you and the team at Human Rights First do day in and day out. We're grateful for the partnership. I'd also like to thank American University and Dean Goldgeier for hosting this important event today. And thanks to all of you for being here this afternoon for this very important and historic discussion. Last April, we woke up to some chilling news. Zulhaz Mananan, a leading LGBTQ activist in Bangladesh, had been brutally murdered by religious extremists. He had been an employee at USAID in Bangladesh and was the founder and publisher of the only LGBTQ magazine in his country. To say that Zulhaz and his friends and colleagues were brave would be a vast understatement. They stood up to death threats and attacks, all while receiving no assistance from the Bangladeshi government, who time and time again looked the other way. Many of Zulhaz's friends and colleagues had to flee Bangladesh after his murder, including one of them who's here in the audience with us today. He's currently working with us here in Washington, D.C. at HRC Global to continue the crucial work to advance equality in his homeland. With his safety and security in jeopardy, he can't be identified here today, but I want him to know that all of us in this room applaud his bravery and his courage. What happened in Bangladesh last April is just one reason why the United States must play a crucial role in protecting LGBTQ human rights around the world. And for the past 8 years under President Obama, we have seen our government do just that. From the 2011 White House memorandum that made LGBTQ human rights part of our nation's foreign policy objectives, to the appointment of Randy Berry as the State Department's first ever Special Envoy for LGBTI human rights, the administration has made history in its efforts to protect the human rights of LGBTQ people, and in doing so, equality has become a pillar of American foreign policy. This would not have been possible without the leadership of President Obama, Vice President Biden, and Secretaries Clinton and Kerry, nor would it have been possible without the leader that I have the honor of introducing to you today. She has been there every step of the way. When she was U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, she played a crucial role in pushing through that historic LGBT rights resolution at the UN Human Rights Council. And as National Security Advisor, she oversaw the Obama administration's strong response to Uganda's notorious Anti-Homosexuality Act in 2014. Thanks to her leadership, the U.S. banned Ugandan officials from entering our country, canceled joint military exercises, and shifted aid away from the Ugandan government. And when Gambia's president said that he would personally, and I quote, slit the throats of any gay men in his country, she forcefully and publicly condemned his threats. And I was personally gratified that she took the time out of her busy schedule earlier this year to welcome to the West Wing of the White House a group of courageous and brave LGBTQ leaders from around the globe for HRC's first ever global summit. We've been so lucky to have an administration that is eager to work with us and to work with groups like Human Rights First to protect each and every person's human rights and dignity, no matter who they are or who they love. The fact is, LGBTQ people around the world are looking to us to be that beacon of hope. And at a time when extremists are throwing gay men off buildings, when transgender women are being relentlessly attacked in Central America, and when laws are being passed to silence and to marginalize LGBTQ people. They need American leadership now more than ever before. And we must continue to open our doors to those who are escaping violence and escaping persecution, not build a wall around the promise of liberty and justice for all. Our speaker this afternoon has placed LGBTQ human rights front and center in our nation's foreign policy and national security. And we are so grateful for her leadership and for the life-saving work of this administration. So now, please join me in welcoming our friend, our ally, and our champion, U.S. National Security Advisor, Ambassador Susan Rice.
Good afternoon, everyone. Chad, thank you so much. Elisa, Jim. It's not every day I get 3 introductions. I'm deeply grateful to the Human Rights Campaign and Human Rights First, who fight so admirably to promote equal rights and dignity for all. I also want to thank the AU School of International Service, President Kerwin and Dean Goldgeier for hosting us. Jim and I were colleagues at the National Security Council back in the 1990s. And these days, I spend too much of my days in the Situation Room, where there are no windows and there's no natural light. So this beautiful atrium is really a welcome change of scenery. And I'm honored to join so many dedicated advocates and allies in the fight for equality. A couple of years ago, I had the privilege to meet with one of those advocates, a Ugandan LGBT activist named Frank Mugisha. Many of you know him. I first heard of Frank when he led the opposition to Uganda's notorious Anti-Homosexuality Act. A day after the law was passed, a Ugandan tabloid published his picture in a list of, quote, top 200 homos, exposing Frank to grave personal risk. Shortly after that, sitting in my office in the West Wing, Frank and I discussed the situation that he and other LGBT persons faced in Uganda and how best the US could support their efforts. Frank spoke softly, but with vision and the moral authority that comes from standing up to persecution. I came away impressed by Frank's eloquence, and even more by his courage. This past August, Frank was attending a Pride Week event when the police raided the venue. They beat up a number of trans people in attendance, forcibly touching them to establish their so-called real gender. Some participants were held at gunpoint. Frank himself was handcuffed and thrown into a police truck. Within 45 minutes of the raid, our team at the White House started receiving reports from civil society organizations, including HRC. That same evening, the State Department organized an emergency call with the US Embassy in Kampala. Our ambassador engaged the Ugandan government. The next day, I tweeted a photo of Frank and me that we'd taken during his visit to my office. Our message was unmistakable. The United States government cares. Within 24 hours, Frank and the other activists were released. We cannot give every case the attention we were able to give to Frank's, as much as we wish we could. And sometimes our efforts are best served by raising our concerns privately. But when a gay civil society activist from a foreign country can be heard at the highest levels of the US government, that itself is progress. When the United States can encourage another nation to do the right thing, together we're bending that arc of the moral universe ever so slightly towards justice. Yet, when countries enshrine homophobia and bigotry into law, when police abuse and arrest citizens simply for being who they are, when Frank's friend and fellow advocate David Cato is bludgeoned to death with a hammer in his own home, we still have a great deal of work to do. So today I'd like to discuss the significant progress we've made in advancing LGBT rights, the challenges we still face, and where I believe the United States must continue to focus in the years to come. The unshakable conviction that all people are equally endowed with fundamental and irrevocable rights has been central to our nation from the beginning. The story of America is one of striving to fulfill our ideals and always gradually expanding the circle of inclusion. It stretches from Selma to Stonewall to frontiers yet to come. For me, this issue is deeply personal. As the daughter of proud citizens who suffered the indignities of Jim Crow, I never forget that I stand here today because those who came before me pried open doors that had long been shut to people who look like me. As a public servant and as a mother, I don't want my children or anyone else's to be limited by how they look, who they worship, or who they love. As President Obama has said, quote, "Our journey is not complete until our gay brothers and sisters are treated like anyone else under the law. For if we are truly created equal, then surely the love we commit to one another must be equal as well." Of course, it's taken generations of protest and struggle to begin to realize that vision. Many have fallen in the battle that continues. Heroes like Harvey Milk, Eric Lembembe, Zulhaz Manan, and too many others. Matthew Shepard, killed for the crime of being himself, would have turned 40 this year. Whether we're talking about race, religion, sexual orientation, or gender identity, this fight for equal rights is what our history and values demand. It is also profoundly in our interests. If we reduce the disparities that can lead to instability and violence, we increase our shared security. Countries do better across every metric when they tap the talents of all their people. A 2014 USAID study estimates that expanding rights for a country's LGBT population is associated with an increase in GDP. So advancing equality is both morally right and strategically smart. From his earliest days in office, President Obama and those of us on his national security team have worked to strengthen LGBT rights and promote them at home and abroad. There is no question that we still have a long distance to go. But we can be proud of the fact that the steps we've taken towards a more perfect union and a more just and equal world are indeed real. Just 8 years ago, when President Obama took office, the federal government treated violent crimes motivated by anti-LGBT bias the same way as any other. Today, law enforcement has the tools to prosecute those heinous acts for what they are, hate crimes. 8 years ago, LGBT service members had to hide who they loved to serve the country they love. Today, as President Obama has said, "Don't ask, don't tell, don't exist no more." The Secretary of the Army is a proud gay man, and transgender Americans can now serve openly. 8 years ago, same-sex marriage was legal in just 2 states. Today, thanks to so many people in this room and beyond, DOMA is history, and marriage equality is the law of the land in all 50 states. That Friday night of the landmark Supreme Court ruling, my husband and I took a photo together that we cherish, outside the White House, lit up in the colors of the rainbow, to celebrate what we've always known, that love is love is love. When I started working in government in the 1990s, an openly gay ambassador was almost inconceivable. You couldn't even get a security clearance if you were LGBT. One of my closest staffers, as a young Foreign Service officer, once asked if he and other employees could screen a documentary at the State Department about a gay nightclub in Cairo that was brutally raided by the Egyptian police. He was told no. It would be too controversial and too damaging to our relationship with Egypt. That was in 2003. Not long ago, the State Department would pay for a diplomat's pet to travel to his overseas post, but not his or her same-sex partner. In the event of an embassy evacuation, a diplomat's loved one could be left behind. I'm not making this up. Under President Obama, LGBT federal employees and their families now enjoy the same benefits as their coworkers. Federal contractors cannot discriminate against LGBT people. Transgender employees can obtain passports that accurately reflect their gender identity. LGBT people can serve openly and proudly throughout the government, from desk officers at the State Department to the NSC staff to 8 openly gay ambassadors. In Vietnam this past May, I got to catch up with Ambassador Ted Osius. Ted and I are colleagues going back 20 years when we were together as junior staffers. As one aide commented, Ted is not the gay ambassador to Vietnam. He is the US ambassador to Vietnam who happens to be gay. Secretary Kerry, as you've heard, also created a special envoy for the human rights of LGBTI persons and appointed Randy Barry, a distinguished veteran diplomat who we're honored to have with us today. Randy's position is the first of its kind anywhere in the world, and he's been relentless and indefatigable, visiting dozens of countries, engaging with governments, and working with civil society, faith, and business leaders to help strengthen LGBT rights. In 2011, President Obama released a landmark presidential memorandum directing that our diplomacy and foreign assistance promote and protect LGBT rights all around the world, from ensuring that our assistance advances equality to protecting vulnerable LGBT refugees to engaging international organizations in the fight against discrimination. We're putting this directive into action through efforts like the Public-Private Global Equality Fund, which has allocated $30 million to support advocates on the front lines in 80 countries. And we've hosted 3 major White House conferences on LGBT rights to bring together activists, government leaders, and civil society to strategize on how to advance these goals. I'm equally proud of the progress we've made in our multilateral institutions, an effort I was honored to lead during my 4.5 years as UN ambassador. In 2010, for the first time ever, the United States joined the United Nations Core Group, a group of countries working to put LGBT rights front and center. We worked in the Human Rights Council to pass the first UN resolution exclusively on the human rights of LGBT people, and we succeeded. We fought to allow several LGBT organizations to gain UN accreditation and have their voices heard, and we won. When a UN committee voted to eliminate any mention of LGBT individuals from a resolution condemning the extrajudicial killing of vulnerable people around the world, I said, hell no. On Human Rights Day that year, I pledged to use all of America's influence to reverse that outrage. We battled to restore the reference to sexual orientation, and once again, we won. These were some of my proudest moments at the UN, and I'm deeply gratified that my successor, Ambassador Samantha Power, has been a tremendous champion of LGBT rights and has continued strong American leadership on this issue. Last year, the United States blocked a mean-spirited Russian effort to deny benefits to the families of gay UN employees. Ambassador Power might have had to drag a few folks out of the bathroom, but we won that vote too. In August of last year, the United States and Chile co-sponsored the first ever UN Security Council meeting on LGBT issues, which focused on ISIL's violence against LGBT people. After the appalling terrorist attack in Orlando, the United States secured a strong condemnation from the Security Council, including the first ever mention in a Security Council text of sexual orientation. And this year, we successfully lobbied to appoint the first independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, giving the United Nations a strong advocate to report on and work to prevent violations of LGBT rights worldwide. This is what progress looks like. This is what sustained American leadership can help to achieve. This is what we mean when we insist that LGBT rights are human rights. At the same time, we're seeing public attitudes evolve with breathtaking speed. Brave professional athletes have come out. The show Transparent continues to rack up Emmy Awards. Last week, dozens of White House staffers, gay and straight, gathered on the steps of the Executive Office Building wearing purple to take a stand against LGBT bullying. And earlier this month, on National Coming Out Day, Americans across the country told friends and family who they were, and in countless instances were reassured that they were loved and valued as ever. Across the globe as well, equality is on the march. A decade ago, nearly half the countries in the world, 92 nations, criminalized same-sex relationships. As of last year, that's down to 75 countries, still far too high, but directionally correct. Anti-LGBT laws are being challenged and lifted from Mozambique to Belize. The United States is now one of nearly 24 countries with marriage equality. Nepal's new constitution is the first in Asia to ban discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. A surge of openly LGBT politicians are being elected, including the Prime Minister of Luxembourg and transgender legislators in Venezuela and the Philippines. Boisterous pride parades are appearing in rather unexpected places, like Kyiv and Taipei. Day by day, we're overturning discriminatory laws, changing hearts and minds, ending what Harvey Milk called the conspiracy of silence. Yet, as President Obama has warned, progress is not inevitable. History does not just move forward, it can travel backwards. Paradoxically, the growing acceptance and visibility of LGBT rights at home and abroad has in too many cases prompted a deeply troubling backlash. Just 5 months ago, the world was jolted by the horrendous attack on the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, the deadliest mass shooting in American history. Across the United States, we've seen a disturbing increase in laws denying services to gay people and proposals for so-called bathroom bills targeting the trans community. Meanwhile, countries like Indonesia are making it harder for LGBT citizens to enjoy their rights. Governments in Central Asia and Eastern Europe are considering or have passed laws even worse than Russia's infamous propaganda law, which prohibits disseminating information about non-traditional sexual relationships. meaning that gay parents can't talk to their own children about their relationships. Last summer, Russian authorities arrested a gay couple for the crime of placing a candle at a memorial for the Orlando victims. By some counts, in as many as 10 countries, same-sex acts are punishable by death. And in Iraq and Syria, ISIL has unleashed a unique brutality on LGBT people, dragging gay men behind trucks, stoning them, burning them alive. ISIL works with chilling efficiency, often going through cell phones and social media accounts of their victims to identify more LGBT individuals for slaughter. As we speak, the United States is supporting Iraqi and Kurdish forces as they push to liberate Mosul, where ISIL fighters were taped hurling gay men off of buildings. As one Iraqi man testified before the United Nations, and I quote, "In my society, being gay means death." So while we can be proud of what we have done together, we cannot forget that our work is very far from finished. And with the time remaining, allow me to focus on how I believe the United States should intensify our efforts to protect and promote these rights. First, the United States must continue to integrate LGBT rights into our government and foreign policy. That includes creating a more diverse national security workforce. This is an issue that I'm particularly passionate about and one that President Obama has prioritized. Because without tapping America's full range of races, religions, ethnicities, social and economic experiences, without embracing people of every sexual orientation and gender identity, we're leading in a complex world with one hand tied behind our backs. The United States also needs to do more to institutionalize efforts to promote LGBT rights. As part of that commitment, I'm pleased to note that just yesterday, a new rule went into effect that explicitly prohibits discrimination by USAID contractors. This rule means that any organization that contracts with USAID must ensure that all people can benefit from its federally funded programs, regardless of race, religion, disability, or sexual orientation and gender identity. It's a major step towards ensuring that American assistance is provided in a fair and equitable manner. In addition, the administration has made clear that the President would veto the House-passed National Defense Authorization Act this year because, among other provisions, it would undermine important worker protections prohibiting discrimination by federal contractors, including against gay people. This provision is a step in the wrong direction, and that's why we'll continue working to ensure that every qualified American worker can hold jobs funded by the American people. Second, the United States must continue to stand up and speak out when the rights of LGBT people are threatened. Chad, as you put it, nations that place LGBT people in the crosshairs of danger must know that the United States will not turn a blind eye. This is not merely to name and shame. It's not about being self-righteous. It's about leading the world to the recognition that in the 21st century, discrimination cannot be tolerated, and prejudice comes with a price. I don't pretend that the United States has a stellar record. Hardly. And yes, in service of our national security interests, we sometimes engage with governments that do not respect the rights we hold most dear. But I'm proud that when we've witnessed anti-LGBT violence or discrimination, the United States has put our opposition to this behavior front and center. That's why President Obama spoke out on this issue in Senegal and in Kenya, where he publicly declared that treating people differently because of who they love is wrong. That's why when Ambassador Wally Brewster a former HRC board member, was viciously slandered and pressured to leave the Dominican Republic this year, we didn't bow to bigotry. We underscored that Ambassador Brewster had the full support of President Obama, the White House, the State Department, and the entire US government. And when the president of the Gambia said that gay Gambians should have their throats slit, we strongly condemned these abhorrent comments, as well as legislation that had been enacted that restricted the rights of LGBT people and the reports of arrest and torture of LGBT individuals. Based in part on this shameful record, we revoked the Gambia's trade preferences, and the United States government should continue to respond swiftly and surely to this kind of repression. Third, the United States must continue working with our partners in multilateral organizations to build international support for LGBT rights. Now, it's not always easy to make change through an organization like the UN. Take it from this former UN ambassador. But we've had some great partners, including our outgoing UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who I want to thank for his leadership on these issues. We've also enjoyed vital support from friends in the Global South, and these partnerships are a very good thing, because as influential as the United States is to change behavior around the world, we have to work as a team. You might rightly ask whether a UN resolution ever changes behavior in the real world. The truth is, sometimes it can. A few decades ago, the idea that women and girls should be treated equally was controversial. Now, thanks in part to work in multilateral institutions, gender equality is written into our new Sustainable Development Goals. It's on the agenda in countless meetings. Views and policies have shifted. So when we include language acknowledging sexual orientation in a UN resolution, or hold an unprecedented UN Security Council meeting on LGBT issues, we create new norms and expectations. We redefine what's acceptable and what's not. Finally, the United States must continue to work with civil society and other partners to improve LGBT lives on the ground. I've joined President Obama as he's met with LGBT activists from St. Petersburg, Russia, to Havana, Cuba. Earlier this year, as Chad mentioned, I got to meet 30 advocates from around the world attending HRC's Global Summit. I'm constantly amazed by the passion, creativity, and commitment of activists on the front lines of change. So help us understand and address the challenges that you face. Help us explore ways to keep expanding the reach of equality, such as by recognizing the unique concerns of intersex individuals. Keep coming to us with your ideas, your stories, your insights, and your requests. Press us to live up to the ideals I've described. I know the challenges are daunting. The slurs, the hate, the violence can feel overwhelming. But when I look at what we've accomplished, I'm filled with hope. I'm hopeful when I think of how my own son and daughter are part of a generation in this country that embraces LGBT rights as obvious and uncontroversial. I'm hopeful because of you, and I'm hopeful because last month, my husband and I celebrated our 24th wedding anniversary. For many couples, that might not seem remarkable, but we remember quite clearly when we started dating almost 35 years ago, that many people said that someone who looks like me shouldn't marry someone who looks like him, that interracial marriage was unnatural and immoral. Stop me if that sounds familiar. That fight for equality was just, and so is this one. We have largely won that first fight, and we will win this one. Ultimately, we'll realize, as the activist and poet Audre Lorde said, It's not our differences that divide us. It's our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. What fitting words today. Somewhere in the world right now, there's a young boy lying awake at night, guarding a secret he's kept for as long as he can remember. Somewhere there's a young woman who can love both men and women and has no one to tell her that that's okay. Somewhere in the United States, there's a man who's always felt like a stranger in his own body. So to every person who might still be struggling with who they are, trying to reconcile who they love with the faith or the traditions they love, know this: we see you, we hear you, we are here for you. And on behalf of all those people, each of them a child of equal worth, a child of God, let us renew our efforts to battle discrimination in all its guises and embrace diversity in all its forms, until every one of us is truly treated equally, no matter who we are, where we live, or whom we love. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for such incredible remarks, and congratulations to you and Ian on your anniversary. So we collected some questions, and your staff has been nice enough to give us a few minutes here for you to respond.
They always do that to me.
So we have, so the first three go together. So I'm going to read the three together. You'll see how they go together. The first is from Blessing Iqbal, who's a student in our Ethics, Peace, and Global Affairs Master's Program, who asked, how can the U.S. continue to support LGBTQ rights globally without inserting imperialism, or coming across as imperialistic? Somebody from Twitter asked, how do we challenge the narrative that homosexuality and other LGBTQ identities are Western values? And then Joe Esparza, a human rights campaign supporter, asked, how do we promote LGBTQ issues globally when our own commitment to human rights is in question, something that you addressed briefly at the end?
Well, I think the common theme among those questions is how do we be effective advocates, given that we bear some baggage of our own? And I think the first answer is that what we are insisting on, what we are demanding, is not that every individual or every country in the world share our culture or share our laws, but that we all must accept that whether we're talking about race or religion or sexual orientation, that we cannot criminalize lawful, peaceful, non-threatening human behavior out of hate. That is not consistent with universal values. It's not consistent with the values that we all hold dear and we all rely on to have basic dignity and freedom. And we will, as the United States of America, I am confident, continue to promote and support and defend those rights around the world. But we have to be somewhat nuanced or calibrated in how we do so. We can't scream from the rafters in every context. There's times for private diplomacy. There's time for quiet advocacy. There's time for very public and confrontational engagements. We have to be careful not to put in harm's way individuals who may not be prepared or protected from the ramifications of being exposed. But the same issues apply whether we're talking about women's rights or religious freedom. We encounter resistance to our advocacy on human rights broadly in many different contexts. And if the United States were to take the view that because we are imperfect, we have no ability to speak out, then nobody would speak out. We are imperfect. We have to acknowledge our imperfections. We have to speak openly about the flaws that we're still trying to rectify in our society. But the fact of the matter is we have a history of improving on ourselves. And that's all we're asking anybody else to do. And we must continue to do our work here at home to respect the rights of all Americans.
The next question, I don't have a name on it, but it says, you concede in your, and it follows on this, you concede on in your remarks that the U.S. finds itself forced to do business with some governments that don't share our approach to LGBTQ rights. In those cases, how do you achieve a balance between our values and broader national security imperatives? Well,
Jim, as you know, and I think as all your students know, this is a challenge we face across the world on all issues of human rights. It particularly applies to our advocacy for LGBTQ rights, but it frankly applies when we're talking about women's rights in repressive societies, when we're talking about religious freedom and protection of refugees and the vulnerable of any sort. And the fact is that we have to be able to do multiple things as a world's leading power. We have interests, we have steps we need to take to protect Americans and our fundamental security, and that entails sometimes working with countries whose values diverge from our own. I don't need to name names, I mean, you know who they are. And there are a lot of them. And then there are times when we have to work with countries that may not necessarily be partners in the traditional sense, but they're countries that are significant and that we can't, in some instances, steer around. And you know who they are too. And we can't shy away from doing the business that we must to protect our people and our country and our interests around the world. And we can't shy away from being faithful to our values. And sometimes we just, we'll stand up and say something in a meeting in Saudi Arabia that maybe our partners don't want to hear, but that we feel needs to be said.
This one comes from Karina Hendren, who's a student in our master's program in international communication. And it's, how should the U.S. government approach U.S. groups who propagate anti-LGBTQ rhetoric abroad?
Well, that's a very tough challenge. And it's become a real issue in a number of places where two sets of our values clash. On the one hand, we believe very deeply in free speech and in freedom of association, and we won't prevent Americans traveling and speaking freely abroad as long as they're not inciting violence. That is who we are as Americans. On the other hand, we don't want that to be used as a reason or an excuse for countries to exclude Americans or exclude advocates that they disagree with. And that's a very difficult balancing act, and it requires us trying to encourage and counsel Americans to be mindful of the impact of their actions and their rhetoric. On the other hand, we have to be very direct with foreign governments that we're not going to endorse in any way their efforts to muzzle Americans because they don't like what they have to say.
There's been a lot of discussion over the recent months about the whole issue of refugees, asylum seekers, and so on, and one of our alums from our Global Governance Policy and Security Program, Sasha Stein, asked what kinds of specific challenges are there when it comes to assisting LGBTQ refugees and asylum seekers around the world?
Well, in the first instance, the repression and targeting of LGBT people, particularly coming from war zones, is one of the many reasons why we have a moral obligation to be open and generous in the admission of refugees. And we have to be careful. We screen them, we vet them. It takes usually 2 years of vetting for a refugee to reach our shores. And yet, there are real people in horrific situations in need of support. And whether they are children from Syria or LGBT people escaping war in Eastern Congo, these are human beings in need of shelter. And each individual's different. When we bring in refugees, particularly from conflict zones, we are often providing different forms of physical and psychosocial support. And for those that are the particular needs of LGBT people who have been victims of oppression, we will try where we can to be attentive to their unique requirements.
You know, I know that Ian and your daughter are going to be thrilled to have you back after January 20th, but I got to tell you, we're going to miss you in your
I live like
job
around
as
the corner from here.
National Security Advisor. Yes, well, we personally, but I'm just saying as a country. I think we have time for one more question. This came over Twitter. To acquire a work permit in the U.S. for LGBTQ asylum seekers fleeing persecution takes more than 6 months. How and when might this change?
You know, that's not an issue that I'm all that familiar with. I can't imagine that it takes longer for LGBT asylum seekers than it does any other asylum seeker. Steve, am I right about that?
Right.
For everybody.
For everybody, right.
Yeah.
Right, so as a general issue in terms of
Yeah,
speeding up the processing.
We have worked very hard to do two things in the last couple of years. One is to increase the number of refugees that we're able to admit while strengthening and reinforcing the vetting process, and to the extent we can, shortening the timelines. And remarkably, we've been able to do all three of those things to a certain extent, but we've prioritized ensuring that we are properly screening and vetting, even as we find ways to improve our processes. Similarly, once folks are in the United States, and trying to situate them so that they're able to become productive individuals in American society. We're trying to shorten those timelines as well. This is work that's ongoing, and I think we will hand off to our successors substantially improved processes, but far from perfect ones, and they're going to continue to require additional work.
Well, again, thank you so much. And since you are nearby, the Davenport Coffee Lounge is right here. I'd be happy anytime after January 20th to treat you to a cup of coffee if you want to come back over.
Thank you,
For a
Jim.
visit, but we're just thrilled to have you
Thanks
here.
for
Thank
having
you so
me.
much for
Thank
being
you
here.
very much.